So we're at the end of season 10, with an absolute classic of a serial. The Green Death is well known as the one with the giant maggots, but that name is definitely an outsider's view rather than a summer. This serial brings Joe's time with the Doctor and Unit to an end, while at the same time tackling a big political subject, which is still present nowadays. So let's get into this serial and see how it's aged, and why it's worthy of being called a classic. The serial begins incredibly strongly, with it immediately introducing its themes and the mystery of the first few episodes. We have the return of a businessman, Stevens, who owns an oil company, with him bringing the promise of jobs to the area, which is met with applause from the locals, while ridicule from the pro-environmentalists, led by Professor Jones. This scene works really well to establish the conflict, as we have several sides on display. The main two are of course Stevens and Jones, but we also have the people who need the jobs, which Stevens is able to use to his advantage, while they won't listen to Jones. I'll talk more about this while talking about the commentary, as there is something in this scene which isn't really there in the rest of the serial. This is where the threat is introduced, in the form of a man who dies with a glowing green effect on his skin. We are actually introduced to this man first, and watch as he runs from the mines in fear, as we see the infection develop, going from just covering his hand to covering his entire face by the time of his death. This gets the plot immediately going with the mystery of what's happening down in the mines. The rest of episode 1 unfolds at a relaxed pace, with it introducing the characters and giving us time to get to know them, while the Doctor is off on Metabolus 3. This also wrapping up the Metabolus arc, which has been in the background of this season. The Metabolus arc is also worked into the main plot, as the Doctor picks up a crystal while on the planet, which becomes important later. The Doctor doesn't become involved in the main plot until the end of episode 1, and even then he doesn't really do anything until episode 2, as the Brigadier does most of the establishing of the situation in episode 1. It's from here that events begin to have a greater sense of danger, as the lift in the mine is sabotaged while Joe's going down, before her and Bert find the source of the infection, that being some sort of slime, which Bert touches, leading to his infection and tragic death. This also ups Global Chemicals as the main villain, as Stevens becomes less subtle and more connected with the events going on. They offer no assistance and seemingly have disposed of their cutting gear, which forces the Brigadier to find some much further away. They are also responsible for the lift to break failure, and as we learn in episode 3, are dumping waste into the mines. This waste caused mutations in the maggots living within the mine, making them giant and causing them to become deadly to anyone who touches their slime, as it causes the cells to become mutated into maggot cells. While the maggots are the threat on the cover of the box, the real villain is the company, which I think is a great way for a show for a younger audience to still be able to have commentary for an older one. Global Chemicals and Stevens are also one of the best villains we've had in a bit, as they feel so real. It feels like a real company who has power, and what they're doing is just about within the law, so there really isn't anything that can be done about it, or direct action would take far too long to take, due to the channels someone would have to go through. When the maggots are discovered, the Doctor wants to examine them, but Stevens is able to force the Brigadier to seal off the mines, preventing this. And when the Brig tries to stand against this, Stevens is able to get a powerful member of Parliament on the phone. This is really great commentary about the state of the world, where someone who is pushing the law, or doing something clearly immoral, is able to get away with it due to who they know. This little scene is great and has completely gone over my head every time I watch the serial until my most recent rewatch. This obviously leads to the situation becoming worse, as after the mines are sealed, the maggots move above ground and end up across a massive area instead of the confined space of the mines, which makes the threat considerably worse and more immediate. The way we got to this point feels earned and very realistic, with Global Chemicals being behind almost every single bad action. I think it's time to talk about Global Chemicals itself and their part in all of this. So as I should have made clear, the company is behind several deaths alongside the creation of the giant maggots due to their chemical dumping. This makes them the unambiguous villains of the serial, and it isn't subtle about it, as they oppose the heroes continuously. While Stevens is the face of the company, the real boss is kept hidden for most of the serial, until his big reveal, which shows the fact that he is a computer, the Biomorphic Organisational Systems Supervisor, or BOSS for short.
I am the boss. I'm all around you.
So the boss isn't just a computer, instead being a hybrid, as it is combined with a human brain, that of Stevens, which allows for it to be able to feel and act somewhat human, but with the processing power of a computer, meaning that when the Doctor puts it into a logical loop, it gets both annoyed by being unable to find a solution, while continuing to follow the loop. The boss is a character, although limited, as it can't move like Cation. Throughout the earlier episodes, it gives orders to Stevens, which leads to him both brainwashing several of his employees, leading them to criminal acts, alongside committing murder. In some ways, it takes away from Stevens being an evil character and puts it on the boss, which all comes together at the end when the Doctor frees Stevens' mind, and then he destroys the boss. There is a bit of a redemption arc with Stevens in the background, as we see him having trouble carrying out his orders at times, and once his mind's freed, he destroys the boss, which presents him somewhat sympathetically. Although as we don't really know his history from before the serial, it's basically impossible to say what kind of a person he was, which does take away from this a little, alongside the fact that he did make the boss and is meant to be the villain of the commentary by being in charge of the company. But I suppose the best way to make this work within the commentary is if you look at him as someone who was overcome by profit and the investors' demands. Now for the Nut Hutch, or for its proper name, the Hoe Wheel Community, which is a community of like-minded people who want to save the planet, with them all being people who've gone through some sort of enlightenment and leaving their lives behind to find better ways to live, with the house itself being powered by naturally generated electricity and all the people living off of fungus. We unfortunately don't meet many of the community, with only Professor Jones being prominent, although in the latter episodes we do get more time with Nancy, who is the mother figure within the community, with her mostly being there to assist people rather than doing anything herself. She's the one who does all the food preparation and makes the treatment for Jones while the Doctor has to save the world. It doesn't make her a bad character, but it would be nice if we had some more time with her as a character rather than as a tool for the script. Professor Jones, who I should mention that his first name is Cliff, is of course a big part of the serial, with him basically being the whole reason that Joe went down in the first place. Throughout he is a help to the Doctor and unit, beginning with his assistance in the rescue of Joe, even if it is somewhat his fault that she went into the mines. Then in the later episodes we see his scientific side on full display as he tries to find a cure or a way to kill the maggots, which prove immune to conventional means. So, military means. The last section of the serial then puts him in peril due to being infected, while trying to save Joe, who snuck out to get a maggot. In quite a few ways the serial makes him a bit like the Doctor, with him being someone who cares about the Earth and wants to preserve it, while also being a scientist, which is something important as it forms a big part of his and Joe's relationship. So now let's talk about that relationship and Joe as a whole, as this serial is a bit mixed for her. So the big thing we have to establish before going forwards is that this is Joe's final serial, with her leaving to be with Cliff at the end. Due to this being her final serial, she does more than she did in the previous serial, although that's partly due to the writing team behind the script. Throughout we have her being confident in getting into danger, notably when she goes into the mines and later when she gets the maggot, which nearly leads to her death. This is somewhat balanced out by her having a lot of scared moments, where she's either sad or being clumsy. A lot of her clumsiness is around Cliff, with her being the one to find the cure by accident. At the same time, her sadder moments are also all spent with Cliff, who consoles her. This building up their relationship further, even if I think it's often hindered by the constant shouting of Cliff, with him often calling her an idiot or insulting her. In some ways this romance is charming, but in others it's a bit strange. But unlike the previous ones, this one sticks, which does make her attempted relationship in the previous serial even funnier, given how nothing that was. But one moment which shows how much she cares about him is when she asks a second favour from her uncle at the United Nations to make Ho-Wheel a research facility. Joe choosing to leave the Doctor is powerful, and it's the first time in a while where a companion has chosen to leave. Her final scene is one of the best in the show, as the two of them can't really state their feelings, with the Doctor quietly walking away deeply saddened. It's quite akin to the Doctor and Susan separation, although this time it's a companion leaving him, with them both knowing that this was going to happen. I think it does work better here, as it's Joe's leaving instead of being left behind, while still having the same emotional weight behind it. Although it is just better as the circumstances of where she's staying are better than the end of the world with some guy she barely knows. At least it's just Wales this time. So let's talk about the Doctor, and he's quite varied here. As mentioned before, he doesn't really get involved early on, with him finally getting to Metabolus free, but once he returns he gets right into the action, with him going waist deep right from the off. This trip leads to the Doctor acquiring the Metabolus crystal, which is an important plot device in this serial, as it's used on several occasions to break the brainwashing of people, which yes, I can agree that it's convenient that he got it just in time for the events of this serial, but it is cool to see something from one adventure being used in another, even if they're from the same serial. The serial shares some similarities to the Silurians, with its use of the Doctor, with him having to find a cure to the disease while at the same time having to talk down the villain to prevent things from getting worse. But in this case, the villain is a human. This often ends with him getting in shouting matches, which never end well, as the opposition never listens. The finding of a cure section is interesting, as we really haven't seen much of the Doctor's biological knowledge of science in ages, as it's usually technological, so it's great to see it again. Beyond that, we also have him involved in one of the biggest fights in the show, as we see a big battle between the Doctor and several guards, which takes his usual Venusian karate to another level. Yes, it is clear when it's his stunt double, as the wig is a very different shade to Pertwee's hair, but it's such a great fight. But the big bit to talk about is the Doctor's disguises, as when he breaks into Global Chemicals for the second time, he uses several of them. With him first being a milkman, which lets Pertwee show off his Welsh accent, and the funny persona the character is given. And later the iconic cleaner, which while I have been critical of the out-of-place comedy, gives us some great moments.
Can we say one word?
I like your handbag.
Do you? Well, watch out I don't slosh you with it.
This scene ends up feeling very Troughton-like, especially from the Highlanders, as he took on a similar disguise during that serial. So now for Unit, who all get to shine here, which feels odd to say after the last few serials. The Brigadier is on point here, with him getting a lot of arguments, while also having many memorable lines. The most notable of this is his speech before shooting at the maggots. One thing that feels like a bit of a change-up is when he assigns Yates to be an undercover operative at Global Chemicals, as he doesn't trust them. While we have seen Unit use undercover operatives before, it's been a while since we have, with this feeling akin to the Invasion when Unit was more a spy agency than military group. We also had the fact that this is the first time that the Brigadier is actively suspicious of the person in charge of industry, at least to the point that he takes direct action. This also shows some change in him, as at the beginning he was in support of Global Chemicals, but as he meets them and spends time in the environment, he changes his tune. We also have a bit of an arc for him, in which he goes from disliking the fungus food to loving it, to the point that the characters are able to joke about it. Now let's talk about Yates next, as this serial actually uses him for the first time in ages. Since his first season, Yates has kind of faded into the background. He was barely in season 9 and then wasn't in the Three Doctors. Even when he was in season 9, he felt a bit off compared with the character we got to see in season 8. And it was unfortunate, as it never really gave me a chance to warm up to the character, as I've always been more of a Benton fan. And I can see why, as we got so much more time with him. But this serial really uses him. He hasn't been an undercover agent before, as that was always Benton's job. But having him in this position works well, as I've always found him a bit out of place as a captain. But he fits right writing as someone pretending to be from the Ministry. This also gives him several chances to show off his varied skills, as we see him having to take on guards on occasion, and after his brainwashing has been broken, he has to sneak back in and pretend to still be under Stephen's control, and deprogram someone else to get information. There are also some good moments of comedy with him, notably the scene with the Doctor, I mentioned before, but it's overall a great showing for Yates, who has been a bit of a non-character for the past season or so. Benton is the one who feels a bit odd here, as for the most part he's quite serious, while there are still great comedic moments for him, notably when he's feeding the fungus to the maggots, and he's treating them like cats, to the point that the Doctor tells him off. But for the most part he's quite serious in the serial, and feels a lot more like a sergeant than usual. It is a bit strange for him, but it works fine enough, as we still have the comedy moments. I think this is the serial where he's definitely the weakest of the three, which is a bit of a changer, but it works fine enough. Somewhat oddly for a serial set in Wales, there aren't too many Welsh characters in the serial. While there is Jones, most of the Welsh characters are smaller members of the community, who are only in a few episodes, with the Milkman being the most notable. Although since we're set in Wales, it did mean we get to see Telfrin Thomas appear in the show again, as he previously appeared as Mullins in Spearhead from Space, although here he has a far bigger role. The final things I want to talk about are the maggots and the bit of commentary that I mentioned at the beginning. The reason I want to talk about the maggots is to see them as animals, as within the story they are innocent to everything happening, and have become these creatures who need to be exterminated to protect the grander world. There is something tragic here, as within the story about protecting the planet, there are these innocent creatures which have paid the price and are being killed by the good guys because they are too dangerous due to the careless greed of humanity. Throughout the serial they mostly sit around and don't do anything, but are deadly creatures. The only times when they are aggressive is when one attacks one of Stephen's men, who was trying to get it, and then after their metamorphosis and they become flies. The fact that the maggots are just animals and are the big threat of the serial could be seen as the idea of how humanity's greed is turning the world against us. Next is that bit of commentary, as this one scene has a bit more depth, which the serial doesn't really explore, and actually stands against the ideas which Professor Jones suggests. So during the opening scenes, while Stevens is being objected to by Jones, a miner points out that they need jobs and don't have the ability to live like people in the Nuthatch. Now we obviously view this scene through Jones's eyes, but it brings up such a good point, as Jones is a Nobel Prize winner, so he's good for money, and his vision for the future doesn't really show much thought given towards what people are going to do for work. While there would still be jobs around, people would still need to build houses and facilities, alongside looking after food production, but to make this clean future where society has changed, then entire industries will be lost, and with the loss of industry on a global scale, there goes the loss of countless jobs. The way of living which Jones and the rest of the whole Wheel community live is self-sustaining, but that's only because they have the resources to achieve it. For the average everyday person, this isn't possible, and while Jones's goals are noble, and he wants to improve the world, he doesn't spend any time talking about how jobs and the way society works will still need to adapt to that future. His focus is almost entirely on replacing meat with fungus, but that's as deep as we get with him, with his ultimate goal being a super fungus of sorts, which can completely replace all meats. The focus of the serial is on the oil industry, with the locals having lost their jobs at the coal mine, and they're being offered new jobs, which aren't going to come given the place gets blown up. Now I do have to admit that at the end of the serial, when the Nuthatch becomes a research facility, Jones does say that it will allow for work for the valleys, but how many of the people in this area are going to be cut out for this type of work? They're miners, not scientists. As far as I can see, this doesn't really help most of them. This is the one big problem with this serial, as it falls into the trap that most stories like this do, that being lacking a focus on how the world has to adapt for humans to work in a world that has shifted away from mass industry. Behind the scenes, there's only three things I want to talk about, the first being the ending credits, as they are notably wrong for episodes 2, 5 and 6. The way they are wrong is obvious. They are upside down, but also being played backwards. This was due to the method used to save time in the recording studio, this being that the film was played backwards through the telescene machine, but I have no idea why it has popped up so much in this one serial, but only for half of the episodes. The serial is also notable for introducing some new props and set dressing for the show, in the form of the control centre and other panels used for the boss set. These panels were going to be used a lot more in the show going forwards, but they are notable for their history, as like with the sonic screwdriver prop, they were made for Jerry Anderson Productions, with them being the control desks and set dressing for the command centre on Moonbase in UFO. Finally we have the Metabelus crystal, as the prop would be one of several which Pertwee would take home with him to give to his son, and this will come up again, as this wouldn't be the last time that the crystal would appear in the show. So that's the serial wrapped up, and it's definitely quite a full one. In fact, all the episodes run slightly over the usual length, so there was plenty to talk about. There are lots of strong moments, its commentary works well for the time, and still holds its weight now, even if I think it doesn't expand enough on some of the ideas it presents. The departure of Joe is the strongest moment, as it's the most emotional goodbye we've had in a while, and on par with the first companion departure. It's not exactly a perfect serial, as there is a bit too much CSO as the serial goes on, and given that there is still a lot of location work, it feels a bit odd why it suddenly becomes so present. But that feels like a nitpick of a really great serial. It is worthy of its title as a classic, and ends this season on a high, and is perhaps the peak of the entire Pertwee era.